I want you to imagine something for a second. Not a demon, not a ghost, not something you can see. I mean, something inside you, listening while you think. There was a man like that, and when they asked him who he was, he didn't say his name. He said, "There are a lot of us in here." Nobody remembers his name, and I think that's intentional. Because somewhere inside this story there was a real human being, a man with a mother, with people who knew his face, with a life that made sense. And then something happened that was so complete, so total, that the person he used to be got buried under what he became. By the time this story picks up, nobody's calling him by his name anymore. They're not even really calling him a person. They're calling him a problem. And the problem had been going on for a long time. He lived in the hills outside a town called Gerasa, in the region of the Gerasenes, a stretch of land on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Rocky, isolated, the kind of place where sound carries at night and there's nothing between you and the hills but open air. And somewhere up in those hills, in the burial caves cut into the rock, this man had made his home. Not by choice, by elimination. Because every other option had already been tried and had already failed. The town hadn't abandoned him carelessly. That's important to understand. They had tried to help him, multiple times. They brought restraints, proper ones, iron chains, the kind used on dangerous criminals. And every single time, he broke them, not wore them down over weeks. Broke them, snapped through iron like it was dry wood, like the resistance wasn't even real to him. Ropes didn't work either. Nothing held. And after enough attempts, after enough failures, the people around him had to make a decision that no community ever wants to make. They decided that whatever was happening to this man was beyond what they could contain, and they let the hills have him. So that's where he was, living among the tombs, sleeping if he slept at all, in the dark of burial caves surrounded by the bones of people long dead. Day and night, the Bible is specific about this, day and night. He was screaming, not crying, not calling out for help, screaming. The kind of sound that doesn't have a clean explanation, that carries over the water on still nights and makes fishermen on the lake look toward the shore and then look away again because some sounds are better left unexamined. He was also cutting himself, tearing at his skin with sharp stones from the hillside, bleeding, healing, bleeding again, running through the hills at hours when no living person should be moving through the dark. The town had learned to live with the noise the way you learn to live with anything that can't be fixed, by not thinking about it too hard. But here's the part that gets me. In all of this, the chains, the screaming, the isolation, not one account says he ever hurt anyone else. Everything that was destroying him stayed turned inward. Whatever was inside him was consuming him, and him alone. That detail matters. Hold on to it. But here's what nobody in that town was asking out loud. But everyone was thinking in the quiet of their own homes at night. What exactly had happened to him? Because there's a version of this story that's easy to tell. The version where you keep it vague, where you say he was troubled, disturbed, mentally unwell, and you move on. And I'm not here to dismiss any of that. But that version doesn't explain the chains. That version doesn't explain how a human body, driven by nothing but whatever was happening inside his mind, snapped through iron restraints repeatedly, consistently, without fail. That version doesn't explain what's coming later in this story, which is significantly harder to rationalize away. So let's talk about what the account actually says. The text doesn't build up to it. It doesn't hedge. It says the man had an unclean spirit. And then, as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that an unclean spirit was doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Because it wasn't one. It was never one. The singular was just the surface, the first layer of something that went much, much deeper. But we don't find that out yet. At this point in the story, the town just knows that something is wrong with him, and that wrong thing has made him into something they can't control and can't reach. Think about what that does to a person over time. Not the possession itself, the isolation, the slow process of being removed from everything that makes you human. First, people stop inviting you places. Then they stop visiting. Then they stop making eye contact. Then the restraints come out. And even those fail. And eventually the decision gets made. Quietly, without a formal announcement, the way these decisions always get made. That you're better off somewhere else. That the community works better without you in it. And you end up in the hills, among the dead. Because the living don't have space for you anymore. We don't know how long he had been out there. The text doesn't say. But it reads like it had been a while. Long enough for it to become normal. Long enough for the screaming in the hills to become background noise. Long enough for the man himself, whatever was left of the man inside all of it, to have lost track of the shape of who he used to be. And whatever was inside him knew that, understood it, had been counting on it. Because isolation is not just a consequence of what was happening to him. Isolation was the strategy. Whatever takes root in a person works best when that person is alone, when there are no voices around them strong enough to compete with the ones already inside, when the world has already written them off so completely that nobody comes looking. The tomb was not just where he ended up. It was where he was supposed to end up. The morning it ended started like any other morning on that shore. A boat came across the water from the western side of the lake. It had been a rough night on the water. There are other accounts that describe the crossing, and rough is probably an understatement. But it made it. It always made it. And when it touched the eastern shore and the man aboard stepped off onto the bank, the day looked, from the outside, completely ordinary. Just a traveler arriving in a region he'd never visited. Just a man stepping off a boat onto unfamiliar ground. And then the screaming in the hills stopped. Not gradually, immediately. Like something up there had heard or felt or sensed an arrival that changed the entire atmosphere of the moment. And then there was movement on the hillside. Fast movement, the kind that makes you take a step back before you even consciously register why. And the man from the tombs came running down toward the shore. Now picture what this looked like from the outside. A man who had been living in burial caves, coming full speed down a rocky hillside toward a stranger who had just stepped off a boat, bleeding from where he'd been cutting himself. Filthy, screaming. Or maybe not screaming, maybe completely silent now, which somehow would have been worse. The people who had come over in that boat would have been backing away. Some of them probably ran. This was the man the entire town had given up on, the man who broke chains. And he was coming fast. But the man from the boat didn't move. He stood there, and he spoke. Not screaming back, not calling out in fear. He spoke at a register that cut straight through whatever chaos was happening in that moment, straight through the sound and the movement and the fear. And he addressed whatever was inside the man from the tombs directly. And the man from the tombs dropped to his knees. Not because he was tackled, not because of anything physical. He just stopped and fell to his knees in the dirt at the edge of the shore. And what came out of him in that moment wasn't his own voice. Or rather, it was his voice, his mouth on his throat producing the sound. But the words weren't his. the words came from somewhere else, from whatever was living inside him, and they were words of recognition, of terror. Whatever was inside this man knew exactly who was standing on that shore, and it was afraid. The stranger asked a question. Simple, direct, 4 words. "What is your name?" And the ground shifted, because the answer that came back wasn't a name. It wasn't the answer of a man introducing himself to a stranger on a shoreline. What came back was something that should not have been possible. A voice that was simultaneously one voice and many. A sound that seemed to come from the man kneeling in the dirt, but also from somewhere behind him, around him, inside him, and outside him at the same time. A sound that made the question of what had been happening to this man for all those years suddenly, horrifyingly clear. "My name is Legion, for we are many." Legion. If you don't know the word, here's what it means in the world this story was told in. A Roman legion was the largest standard unit in the Roman military. A full-strength legion contained somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 soldiers. That was not a metaphor when they used it. That was the answer. Not one, not a few, not a handful of dark things that had found their way into a man and made him miserable. Thousands. A number so large it had to borrow a military term just to be communicated. We are many. We are so many that we don't have a single name. We are a multitude. 4,000 to 6,000, inside one human body. And suddenly, everything about his life up to this moment snaps into focus. The sleeplessness. Because how do you sleep when there are thousands of voices? The screaming. Because what else do you do when your own mind is a battlefield with thousands of occupants? The chains breaking, not because he was physically stronger than iron, but because whatever was driving his body in those moments was not operating by the rules that apply to a single human being. The self-destruction, because some part of him, some remaining piece of the man he used to be, was still in there, still fighting, and the only thing available to fight with was his own body. 6,000. And here's the thing that lands harder the longer you sit with it. They had been there long enough to organize, to have a spokesperson, so to understand their situation clearly enough to negotiate. These weren't chaotic, mindless things tearing a man apart by accident. They were deliberate, strategic. They knew what they had, and they knew what they stood to lose, and they were already preparing their case before the question was even finished being asked. That is not the behavior of something that stumbled into a person by accident. That is the behavior of something that chose him, that set up residence and made itself at home, and had been there long enough to become comfortable, long enough to think of that man's body as theirs. Long enough that the idea of leaving, of going back to whatever they came from, was something they were willing to beg to avoid. They begged, 6,000 of them, and every single one was begging. And this is the part of the story that people skip over because it's strange and uncomfortable, and it raises questions that don't have clean answers. But it's also the part that tells you everything about what these things actually were. They didn't just give their name and fall silent. They negotiated. The moment the conversation started, the moment it became clear that whatever authority had just stepped off that boat was real and was not going to be moved, the voices inside the man shifted from terror into strategy. They had one goal: to not be sent into the abyss. That word is used specifically, not just away, not just out of the man, into the abyss, the void, the nothing, the place of complete absence. And the fact that they had a specific fear about a specific destination tells you that they knew exactly what waited for them if things went wrong. They had been around long enough, or were old enough, to know what the abyss was, and they would do anything to avoid it. So they asked for a compromise. There was a herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby. Large herd, the account says about 2,000 animals. And the request was simple. Don't send us to the abyss. Send us into the pigs. Let us have somewhere to go. Let us keep existing. And permission was given. What happened next took seconds. 2,000 pigs, every single one of them, at the same moment, stopped what they were doing and ran. Not in different directions, not the way animals scatter when they're startled. They ran together, as one, in one direction, off toward the edge of the cliff above the lake. And they went over, every single one of them, into the water. And they drowned. 2,000 animals, gone in under a minute. Now here's the question that should be keeping you up right now, the one that the people standing on that hillside watching it happen certainly couldn't answer. Why? Why did they run? Why did every single animal, the moment it received what was transferred into it, immediately and without hesitation choose to die? These were not suicidal animals before this moment. They were feeding, calm, doing what animals do on a quiet morning. And then something entered them, and they ran off a cliff. The only explanation that makes any sense, the only one, is that whatever entered those animals was so immediately, so completely, and so overwhelmingly unbearable that death presented itself as the more tolerable option. That the pigs experienced 1 second of what that man had been living with for years. And that 1 second was enough. That the weight of 6,000 presences crushed 2,000 animals in the span of a moment. And the man had been carrying that for years, alone on a hillside. The herdsmen ran. Of course they ran. They had just watched their entire livelihood, 2,000 animals, throw themselves off a cliff in less than a minute. They ran back to the town and to the surrounding countryside, and they told everyone what they had seen. And the people came out. What they found when they got there was not what they expected. The man from the tombs was sitting on the ground near the shore. Sitting, not running, not screaming, and not tearing at himself. Sitting quietly, wearing clothes. Someone had given him clothes. Completely calm. The Bible describes him as being in his right mind. That phrase, in his right mind. As though for however long this had been going on, his mind had not been his own. As though what they were looking at now was the first time in years, maybe ever, that the person looking back at them from behind his eyes was actually him. And the townspeople were terrified. Read that again. Not relieved, not grateful. Terrified. More afraid of the man sitting quietly on the ground than they had ever been of the man breaking chains and screaming through the night. Because the screaming and the chains they understood, on some level. That was something they had learned to categorize and manage and ignore. But this, a man restored, a problem solved, an explanation they couldn't even begin to construct. This was something else. This was evidence of a power operating in their region that they had no framework for. And when you encounter something you have no framework for, the instinct isn't always wonder. Sometimes it's just fear. So they asked him to leave. The man who had been healed sat there and listened to his own community. The people who had chained him, who had given up on him, who had let him rot in the hills. Ask the only person who had actually helped him to go away. And he didn't argue. He didn't call them out. He looked at the man who had healed him, and he asked the only thing he wanted, the only thing that made sense after everything. Let me come with you. Don't leave me here. Don't leave me alone again. And the answer was no. Not cruel, not dismissive, but no. Then go home. Go back to your people. Tell them what happened to you. tell them everything. And this man whose name nobody remembers, who had been written off by his entire community, who had spent God knows how long being destroyed from the inside out, stood up and went home and did exactly that. That part of the story is almost harder to sit with than the rest of it. Here's what the story doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you what it felt like to be him. To sit there on that hillside in the sudden, total quiet and feel the absence of 6,000 things that had been living inside you. We talk about the healing like it was only a gain, and it was. Obviously it was. But think about the silence. Think about spending years, maybe decades, with thousands of voices, thousands of presences, so loud and so constant that they became the only reality you knew. And then one morning, in less than an hour, all of it just gone. What does that feel like? What do you do with a silence that complete? We don't know. The story doesn't follow him home. It also doesn't tell you what happened to the 6,000 after the pigs died. And that is the part I cannot stop thinking about. Because here's what we established. They needed somewhere to go. That was the whole point of the negotiation. They couldn't just cease to exist. They needed a host, a body, somewhere to exist inside. That was their entire argument. Don't send us to the abyss. Let us go into the pigs. Let us keep existing somewhere. And the pigs died. Almost immediately. Seconds after the transfer, 2,000 animals threw themselves off a cliff. And whatever was inside them, whatever had just crossed from the man into the herd, they would have gotten out first. Because they always get out. Getting out is what they do. Getting out, finding somewhere new, continuing. That is their entire nature. They don't die with the hosts. The hosts die, they move on. So in the seconds before 2,000 pigs hit the water, in that brief window between the transfer and the death, something left. Thousands of somethings. Back into the open air, above that hillside, above that lake, in a region that had just lost its only occupied host, looking for the next place to go. And nobody in the story thought to ask where they went. The herdsmen were watching the pigs. The townspeople were looking at the man. And the disciples were processing everything that had just happened in a morning that had started as an ordinary boat ride. Nobody looked up. Nobody scanned the hillside. Nobody thought to ask the question that should have been the first question anyone asked. 6,000 things that cannot exist without a host, in an open field, surrounded by people, and they needed somewhere to go. The story ends there. 2,000 years ago, on a quiet shoreline on the eastern edge of a lake, the account closes and the witnesses go home, and history moves on to the next thing. Nobody follows up. Nobody documents what happened in the days after. The man goes home and tells his story, and the region eventually settles back into whatever counted as normal. But normal, in that story, he was always a thin surface stretched over something much darker underneath. And if you've ever found yourself awake at 3 in the morning in the quiet, and the quiet felt just slightly too heavy, just slightly more present than silence should be, you're probably fine. Probably.